Okay, so we're good to go. Right, welcome everyone, to everyone attending online and to our panelists. This is the penultimate panel of 3 days of Conference of Multipolar Middle East, and we've had some wonderful papers thus far, covering such a huge range of issues. Today, we are going to be examining Turkey, not just Turkey domestic foreign politics, but also Turkey's broader foreign relations. We have three really good papers. If I could just ask panelists to turn their mics off and their cameras off, please, just while we're doing the introduction as well. Thank you. Yeah, so we've got a great range of papers today. First paper is from Beste Macaes, who'll be presenting on the changing China paradigm of Turkey. Then we have McCall, who'll be presenting on Russia, Turkey, and the Mediterranean, a preview of a new regional disorder. And then finally, Benjamin Beams from the University of Chicago will be presenting on revisionism, law, and bureaucratic self-definition in the new Turkey. So we'll have 20 minutes from each presenter. We've only got 3 papers today, so we've got a bit more time for each presenter, which is great. For those who are attending online, if you could pop your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. We'll do all 3 papers together, and then we'll have a Q&A session after. And I think that's about it for housekeeping. As I was just saying to our presenters before, I shall give you a 3-minute warning and a 1-minute warning. After 20 minutes, I'm afraid I'll put my mic on and I shall interject. But yes, if we can then proceed with our first paper. Beste, after you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much, Edward. So sharing it, I guess that's fine. All right. So the interest for this research came along when working on my master's research last year. I was told by a Chinese official who worked at a very strategic development project in Turkey that the only matter of distrust with Turks was the Uyghur issue. So today I will look at how the Uyghur case found its origins in the contemporary Turkish political narrative, and what is driving the recent change in that narrative today. The changing China paradigm of Turkey. So let me begin by asking who's a Turk, and state that following the Republic, there was always a debate about national identity and where to base Turkish or Turkic roots, also encouraged by the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk himself. Attempts were made to defy the foreign scholars' studies and redefine Turks as well as where Islam was to stand. There were that advocated the purity of the Turks, but also their ability to Turkify multiple civilizations, according to which Turks had established the essence of the Chinese and the Indian civilizations in Asia, but also the Egyptian, Mediterranean, and Roman civilizations. In the early days, what intellectuals at the time called Arabization was denounced, and the Turkic identity was brought forth. And so who is an Uyghur? Well, from the Chinese perspective, an Uyghur is a Muslim. A compromise had to be made in the Chinese mind, perhaps because it was a logical option that the Muslim as a reference point held the better potential in establishing greater national unity, because there was already an ethnic Chinese minority, Muslim minority, the Hui. And the Chinese authorities began sending Muslim Chinese students to Egypt as early as 1930s. And the trend continued. And this is where Uyghurs were introduced to the Muslim Brotherhood. By the end of the Second World War, the Soviet territorial claims over Turkey strained the bilateral relations and allowed the Americans to weigh in and offer Turkey a security alternative, right? And this is also, I would argue, when the contemporary Turkey-China conflict found its roots. Turkey going as far as participating in the Korean War on the American front was a case of sovereignty lost from the Chinese perspective. And perhaps it was. Turkey joined NATO following the war and adopted the fight against communism, completely changing its threat perception from Western imperialism and imperialist invasion to communism. And not long after, Soviet relations so split as well over colliding national interests. So both Turkey and China were to balance it out, if you will, with the United States. Meanwhile, following NATO membership, Turkey began to unravel. Massive protests over a return from secular state, a right to unionize, establishment of a social state swept the country. But at the same time, in fact, a day before the largest protest in Istanbul, the Chinese Communist Party youth held a rally in support of the movements, denouncing the Turkish government. There's a deeper reason for this eagerness to reach out from the Chinese. The Chinese do see similarities in Turkey's republic in their own. The independence war against foreign aggressors, the peasants' resistance to imperialist invasion, and of course, overthrowing of the Sultan. But following the protests, of course, Turkish Prime Minister by then, Menderes, who led the Turkish army to Korea without a parliament's vote, and who signed Turkey into NATO, was hanged as a result of a military takeover. And here's another photo of that rally held in Beijing. And from 1960s to 1970s, following the military takeover, it is true that among university students, there was quite some freedom, a favorable atmosphere for the leftists. The CIA chief Graham Fuller summarized these times as his first assignment overseas, and that the United States was worried about some left-wing movements that were very active. So here's a group of those students Fuller mentions protesting the arrival of Sixth Fleet to Istanbul. And this is when Said Qutb was officially introduced in Turkey as well. I say officially because the person translating the texts, Yaşar Tunagür, was the vice president of the Turkish Religious Affairs Directorate at the time. And we're going to go back to him in a bit. But so the right-wing student movements were rallied around Said Qutb's books and the Muslim Brotherhood ideology by Turkish officials in an effort to counter the communist hype. Here we see a group of right-wing students praying towards the Sixth Fleet and welcoming them as a counter-protest against the left-wing students. Well, inevitably, very quickly, violence unleashed and these groups began clashing, assassinating one another, and yet another military coup happened in 1971. Now, why is this important? Because this is the generation that will then set the agenda for contemporary Turkish politics. There are still individuals in AK Party or MHP ranks or the opposition who took part in these events. They established the fight against communism associations that mushroomed around the country at the time, and who will tell you how it all began with devouring the social justice in Islam one day. And at the time, they're also the ones that initially picked up the narrative that Uyghurs are the racial ancestors of Turks, right? That their land is under Chinese invasion, ultimately making it a Turkish stance within the state. Where this generation really finds its intellectual roots really comes out through certain publications used as both a propaganda tool to recruit and rally university students, but also the general public. So here are some of those early magazines on Xinjiang, mentioned as East Turkestan. Most of intellectual focus and international collaboration can be traced through them and spot writers who continue to be the most important intellectuals of the AKP government until the break within the party in 2016. So these magazines are usually multilingual, Arabic, Turkish, English. American and Turkish professors appear side by side in the research due to language barrier. Turkish professors decide to translate texts on Turkic origins from American research studies, such as Harvard. Here's a blue flag that is introduced. The first edition of the magazine. Here's a map of divided China. In 1990s, we see a national conference of Eastern Turkestan is held in Istanbul. We see gatherings of prominent figures supporting the Uyghur independence. And we see persistence of narrative despite the current changes in the narrative. This is a book called War on East Turkestan. Excuse me, War for East Turkestan. Very anti-China, very confrontational. And it was republished recently by the Turkish History Council. I guess where I'm trying to get at is, can indirect rule introduced by Mamdani in his Define and Rule be used to explain the introduction and support of Muslim Brotherhood ideology in Turkey by the United States during the Cold War? Indirect rule being when the identities of the peoples are formulated ideologically and invested with enduring legal and cultural force on the basis of bogus anthropological and ethnographic theories that serves the political interests of the British rule, but in this case, the American rule. There are similarities between how the student groups were used and unions were infiltrated by the CIA in its fight against communism inside the United States, and Turkey's fight against communism a decade later. And this really brings out the question, was the model somehow adopted? In the 1990s, the United States was aware of the political vacuum following the Soviet collapse, but it was very hard for it to penetrate these suspicious, unwilling former countries, whereas Turkish diplomats did not get the same cold shoulder from these Central Asian republics. Turkey could get in there and be the buffer that the United States needed to keep the region under its watch and really control the narrative. Controlling the narrative in Turkey would mean sort of establishing an invisible containment zone against communist China right at Central Asia. So as Turkey began to go out in the world, rushing to fill in the gaps, the murderous Chinese, the communist infidels, and the invaders of East Turkestan were the narratives most young and conservative diplomats really took with them to the region's neighboring Xinjiang. This is also when Turkey began its infamous education campaign led by the Gulenists throughout Central Asia, gaining access to American individuals who would otherwise be under heavy scrutiny, giving the American officials the upper hand in their dealings with China. Remember the translator of Said Qutb's Social Justice in Islam, Yashar Tunagar? Here he is in the photo, preaching at the Radio Free Liberty. Aside from being a mentor to Fethullah Gulen himself, he was also one of the main figures of Muslim Brotherhood ideology in Turkey. In fact, he was inspected by the Turkish Senate in 1975 and was found to be promoting counter-Republican ideas in close ties with Muslim Brotherhood, and therefore he was discharged from his positions. However, the Muslim Brotherhood was also where Turkish diplomacy met the Uyghurs as well. Here are two Uyghur scholars in 2019 at a Muslim Brotherhood TV station broadcasting from Istanbul, stating China is more dangerous than America, and China is a scorpion, etc. All sorts of anti-China rhetoric there. And so with Turkish government's backing, the schools around Central Asia became recruitment grounds for youth that were prone to radicalization, and the early seeds of grooming that eventually brought Chechens and Uyghurs together in Syria at the ISIS ranks were really began at these recruitment grounds. This became an international scandal when the Chinese released the photos of Uyghurs with Turkish passports and reported Turkish individuals helping Uyghur radicals obtain Turkish passports through Turkish embassies and fleeing China to join ISIS ranks in Syria. Well, what changed? The United States arrived in the Middle East, and the American arrival and the following destruction in the region made it increasingly harder to publicly defend the American intentions and strain the Turkish policy positions. And the Americans really overlooked this public pressure. Of course, the breaking point being the Turkish parliament not granting American troops logistical help in 2003 Iraq invasion. And furthermore, the American backing of the PKK, YPG, is just not a defendable stance in Turkish politics. And the Syrian resistance happened, the failure of the Greater Middle East and Northern Africa project. Now, there's a lot of controversy over whether this kind of project even existed or not, but for what it's worth, we know that the Turkish PM at the time, Erdogan, mentioned it on more than one occasion and named his party as one of the co-sponsors of it, and that Turkey had tasks to deliver within that project. However, following the famous 1 minute moment, the Turkish foreign diplomacy really experienced a downfall under the leadership of Ahmet Davutoğlu, a publicly known Gulenist himself, and his covert meddling into neighbor countries' politics deploying foreign fighters, and plus the inability of Turkish government to deliver in the front line, especially the Syrian front line, really increased the American political and economic pressure on Turkey, eventually causing a rift inside the AK Party government. Then came, of course, the failed coup attempt and the weakening of the Gülenist terrorist organization, and this was crucial because this was crucial in the change of Uyghur narrative, because once the Turkish government purged all these diplomats who were instrumental in providing Turkish passports to multiple Uyghur radicals and their families, and really instrumental in this watch over Central Asia and fight against communism, the pillar, a pillar in fight against communism really was disturbed. It was almost demolished. So China benefited from this, whether it's aware or not. And of course, China's rise, increasingly pressured by the United States, Turkey began naturally looking for alternatives. And the economic investments of China are important for Turkey, but however, I would argue that today Turkey, I think, values technology sharing and technology building much more at this time, especially in telecommunications and defense systems. And conclusion, Turkish government's adoption of the Uyghur case was purely an intellectual grooming of Turkish intellectuals and officials. This was a narrative that they brought in the office and acted on it in their own capacity. And we see that through the Turkish Senate's conviction and discharge of Yaşar Tuneger himself. We see a lot of details in that statement that the Turkish state is really fighting against this foreign ideology, Muslim Brotherhood, that is being picked up by its own officials and used against it, against its interests. Turkey dropped the stance in 2015, designating the East Turkestan Independence Movement a terrorist organization. And this agenda benefited China in implementing its policies within and outside of China regarding the Uyghur separatism. Muslim identity, I would say, is still a strong diplomacy reference in Turkish government's global outreach. However, the trend of political Islam and its reference points, such as the Uyghur case that has emerged during the Cold War, seems to be dropped. And Turkey is more motivated by its national interests, existential threats, etc. Today, in a complete reversal of roles, it is a Turkish opposition parties that has picked up the Uyghur case in the name of human rights. And I will leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Beste. That was a very, very rich presentation, some really very useful historical context there as well for the wider Turkish experience, and fascinating to see that flipping around at the end, like you say, about the opposition coming to represent the Uyghur case more. Wonderful. We'll take questions at the end. So if we move on straight on to our next presentation, which will be Michael McCall on Russia, Turkey, and the Mediterranean. Michael, whenever you're ready.
All right. Let me get the screen share set up.
Okay, that's good.
All good?
Yep.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael McCall. I'm going to be presenting on Russia, Turkey, and the Mediterranean, a preview of a new regional disorder. So this paper is primarily a thought experiment to understand the kind of implications of a logic of multipolarity in the Middle East. And as kind of a test case, I wanted to look at the influence of China and Turkey and their own political or geopolitical competition in the Eastern Mediterranean. Particularly their competition in Syria and Libya. And since I know everyone's probably pretty familiar with the story of Syria and Libya and the involvement of Russia and Turkey, I'll go through this pretty quick to get to the more interesting theoretical points. But I wanted to look at Syria and Libya in particular because they both started as popular revolutions in 2011 in the wake of the Arab Spring. linked very much by mutual identification and moral support, similar chants, similar grievances. But in terms of practical links of, men, material, and, logistical support, it was very, very limited. You had, very few sporadic reports of somebody, after the fall of the Gaddafi regime, there was, be a small group of people who would go to Syria or something like that. But this was very, very rare and very sporadic. Today, of course, as we all know, both are civil wars, and they're not driven primarily by the parties on the ground. They're supported by larger forces outside, and they very much are subject to the kind of multipolarity that I'm trying to look at. And I'm looking at Russia and Turkey and their roles in both of these conflicts, in Syria and Libya. Russia, of course, supports Khalifa Haftar in his operation against the UN-backed GNA in Libya, and they're known as one of the strongest supporters of the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. And on the opposite side, Turkey supports a reduced and repurposed Free Syrian Army in the north of Syria and internationally recognized Government of National Accord, the GNA, in Libya. So in both of these conflicts, Russia and Turkey find themselves on opposite sides. So the aim of this thought experiment is kind of to deduce a larger multipolar conflict, but particularly this geopolitical conflict between Russia and Turkey. You could kind of look at it in two ways. The first way would be kind of a reductionist short story based on ideological aims, where Russia would be backing status quo elements or status quo anti-elements, pre-2011 or authoritarian type elements. That would be but that seems a bit reductionist in nature. What seems more likely is that Russia and Turkey are primarily interested in gaining geopolitical advantage in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is not an ideological struggle that you would have seen, say, in the case of the Arab Cold War, as Malcolm Kurd described it, or indeed the original Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This is first and foremost a geopolitical conflict with very little ideological backing. What's different, and the kind of empirical evidence I want to muster in support of this abstraction theory is the growing flows of men and material that flow between the two battle spaces. Primarily, so you have these Wagner Group operatives that are wielded by Russia, that operate. Wagner Group operates Libya, Syria, Ukraine, probably some other places. And the same Wagner Group operatives operate both in Libya and in Syria. It's very clear that the flow, the human traffic between the two is become fairly substantial. And similarly, on the opposite side, Turkey has flown, the number's indeterminate, but I've heard estimates anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000. The 3,000 number sounds much more likely. But Turkey has flown a number of Syrian mercenaries that they trained in the north of Syria to Libya to support the Government of National Accord in the fight against Khalifa Haftar.
Michael,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. It appears your PowerPoint isn't coming across for our viewers. It's showing that we're seeing your screen, but we're just getting a black box here. So we're not seeing your PowerPoint, I'm afraid. Okay, that's showing now. That's showing now. So great.
It's showing now? Is this better?
If you can keep it. Yeah, if that's okay for you and keeping it on that's great.
Yeah, I can do this.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely. Thank you for catching it early. Right. So going back to, besides the flows of manpower, you can also see that the ebbs and the flows of the two conflicts kind of correlate with each other to a certain extent. For example, Russia decisively altered the balance of power in Syria since its intervention. People were writing lots of op-eds about how the days of the Assad regime were numbered. But once Russia intervened, the war has tilted decisively in favor of the Assad regime. Similarly, while this is still much more in flux, the infusion of Turkish support has radically changed the position of the GNA's strategic position in Libya as well. Khalifa Haftar was routed from Tripoli and the battle lines in Libya have become a little bit more solidified, and even the Egyptians now are seeking to come up with a settlement to solidify the current battle lines, when it looked like the GNA was not going to be able to survive much longer without Turkish support. So because you can deduce a kind of ebb and flow between the fates on one battlefield and the fates on another, my idea is that you can use these separate phenomena that were previously isolated. What happened in Syria stayed in Syria, what happened in Libya stayed in Libya, and you can theorize these two conflicts as being part of one larger geopolitical struggle. But of course, Turkey and Russia are not the only actors in both of these conflicts, and this is why it's explicitly a multipolar situation rather than a purely bipolar conflict between Turkey and Russia. You can talk about Egypt. I just mentioned the Egyptian Peace Conference. You could talk about the Iranian support in Syria. Just as important as the Russians were to supporting the Assad regime, the Iranians were equally important. You cannot cut them out of the picture. So why focus on Turkey and Russia at all? My theory is that only Russia and Turkey appear to have the kind of diplomatic latitude that would actually potentially solve these conflicts. They're the ones that are able to be at every single table negotiating on behalf of their interests effectively. For example, the Saudi-Egypt-UAE bloc, more or less the bloc that quarantined Qatar, they don't negotiate pragmatically, and they don't seem to come up with peace ideas that are actually acceptable. You can see that even now with the Egyptian attempted settlement in Libya. It was immediately rejected by the GNA. And to a certain extent, the kind of allergy to Iran, the allergy to the Ikhwan, becomes kind of an autoimmune disorder. They attack, something that might even be within their own interests, to make some kind of concession. So that's why looking at Egypt as a major player in Libya is less illuminating to the multipolar dynamics than looking at Turkey and Russia. Iran's a very interesting case and would probably be up in a similar league as Turkey and Russia if they weren't as disconnected from the diplomatic mainstream. That limits their ability to sit at every single table, because if there's something that the United States would be involved in, it's very difficult to negotiate with the Iranians. But the fact that all of these players are involved, and it's not just, and I'm not just considering Turkey and Russia, means implies that this is a multipolar dynamics that need to be understood. And the kind of unipolar logic that predominated in 2011, if we were talking about Libya back in 2011, we would be talking solely about the United States for the most part. When we're talking about UN Resolution 1973, we're talking about the attitude of the United States and what the United States was going to do. Now, no one's talking about American involvement in Libya or Syria. We're totally talking about other regional forces, extra-regional forces. In the background, of course, so going back over what the role of the United States used to be, since 1993, the United States was effectively hardwired into the regional subsystem of the Middle East since the Gulf War. And that effectively made most other foreign policies derivative of American foreign policy. But even going farther back, Turkish foreign policy has long been derivative of NATO policy throughout the Cold War, with the exception of the Cyprus issue. An independent Turkish foreign policy is a relatively novel factor. And even up until 2011, the United States was still largely the biggest player. As I mentioned, when we were talking about Libya and UN Resolution 1973, the United States was the major player. But since then, the United States has not involved itself in the aftermath of the Libyan civil war. And the US never really engaged in Syria to begin with. So the unipolar logic that predominated and determined the foreign policies of other regional and extra-regional countries in the Middle East is now gone. And the logic of multipolarity, where you have to balance the interests of a variety of powers, is far more apparent. So this kind of functional multipolarity, because the United States is still the largest military power. It's just the fact that that military power is not utilized gives a lot more freedom of action to Turkey and Russia to pursue their own rivalry. For example, if there were NATO operations going on in Libya and in Syria, it would be much more difficult for Turkey to pursue its own independent policy without considering the larger NATO operations. And Russia would undoubtedly, be more restrained if there was NATO intervention in Syria or Libya, for example. So this multipolarity likely exacerbates regional conflicts. There's a large amount of literature in civil war and on the subject of civil war that talks about, the involvement of foreign powers. It tends to extend the length of conflicts, makes them more bloody, makes the violations of human rights more acute, and thus this kind of multipolar logic probably makes the wars worse. And because one of the interesting factors of this Turkish-Russian geopolitical rivalry is that it's not subject to the kind of impositions of unipolarity like the Saudi-Iran rivalry is. And this is why it's interesting as a thought experiment for understanding multipolarity in particular and what a post-American Middle East would look like. Because the Saudi-Iran rivalry, unlike the Turkish-Russian rivalry, would be qualitatively different. Imagine a world in which the United States didn't exist. The Saudi-Iran rivalry would be very qualitatively different. The Saudis would no longer be able to depend on U.S. forces in the Mediterranean to protect them. They'd have to behave fundamentally differently and take into account, their actual, the actual power they have at their command. So the Turkish-Russian rivalry is different because it wouldn't actually change that much if you imagined a world without the United States. This rivalry is kind of premised on the absence of the United States. And that's why this is much more illuminative in terms of what a post-American Middle East would look like, because it is, in effect, a function of the lack of presence of the United States. But this is purely on the basis of the conflicts in Syria and Libya, though. If you look at direct bilateral cooperation between Turkey and Russia, particularly you could look at the S-400 program, the purchase of Russian-made anti-aircraft missiles. This is actually a cooperation between Turkey and Russia to not alienate the United States, but to reduce dependence, Turkish dependence on NATO, and certainly I'm sure Russia had incentives in terms of that it alienates the United States from Turkey. But the fact that both parties, both Turkey and Russia, participate in this, it alienates the United States from getting involved at all. And American diplomacy has historically been very important to ameliorating conflicts in the Middle East. And the fact that the United States has largely stepped back and this kind of Turkish-Russian diplomacy has had to take its place means that you're talking about much more ad hoc and opportunistic diplomatic channels for ameliorating conflict. You have, the contesting peace summits in Geneva and Astana, and then you have, something that the Egyptians come up with in a couple months to try to end the war in Libya that is boycotted by parties supported by Turkey. So the lack of institutionalized discursive mechanisms is kind of a result of the fact that this diplomatic structure that was buttressed by the United States has essentially collapsed. And so the parties, particularly Turkey, Russia, have to come up with some new diplomatic mechanism to replace it. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Michael. That was excellent and really, speaks to those conference themes of the multipolar Middle East and what, what we might see, going into the future as well. So it's a very, very interesting thought experiment. I really like the way you pitched that. Okay, I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions on that and the first paper as well. We'll move straight on to our final presentation. So Benjamin, whenever you're ready, if you want to start sharing your screen.
Of course. All right. And can you see that all right?
Yep, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And so before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you as well to all of the organizers. I know that it can be quite a tall order to put together an international conference, particularly one that's virtual. So thank you very much. It's nice that we can still do this despite our current conditions. But with that, I'm going to talk about my paper, which is Revisionism, Law, and Bureaucratic Self-Definition in New Turkey. And much of this, or rather much of my argument, has to do with the legal evolution that has taken place from the Ottoman Empire, from essentially the Tanzimat reforms, up until the current period. And I'll get into this as we go on, but it's very clear that Turkey's bureaucratic self-definition has sort of been abandoning secularism, moving away from what it was in the pre-Republic of Turkey era, where Islam was the glue of society, and where religion was the glue of society. And so through this experiment of secularism that's been in Turkey, which has almost been 100 years, it seems very clear and very evident that the Turkish politics are moving back to a more religious, a more historical perspective. And so it's been interesting to see that Erdogan and the AKP party, rather the AK party, have really changed the way Turkey identifies itself and the way they define themselves. And so I think that particularly this new government, and which I call New Turkey, it's not anomalous. It doesn't just come out of thin air. It's rather the result of one logical outcome of a larger national project that started in the early 20th century. And so national reforms began in 1839, essentially with the Tanzimat reforms, and these were a way to attempt to stop the waning Ottoman Empire's power. And fast forward to the 1920s, when the Republic of Turkey was founded, the shift that happened from 1839 to 1923 was quite great. And this is where the social adhesive was damaged. And arguably, contemporary Turkey is still suffering from this trauma, because overnight, essentially, after Mustafa Kemal changed Turkey into a secular state, all of these people that were citizens, who were Muslims, who used their religion as a tool of definition that defined the state and also their livelihood, changed. You know, the language changed. It's very difficult to understand this, I think, now from a contemporary perspective. But you know, if you could imagine yourself in this position, it would be incredibly difficult to cope with a new language, with a new culture, with a new identity of what the state was. And Kemalism, Mustafa Kemal's viewpoint and world outlook, was very much focused on moving forward. It was forward-looking. It was looking to the future, looking to create a more modern state. And of course, modern is a contentious word, but the idea was to amend certain laws to make it closer to a European state. But after 100 years of secularity, right, this project of secularity, it seems that Turkey is regressing to a mythical Ottoman past. And I use the word mythical very intently because the period that Erdogan and his political party is referring to is very much an imaginary period. It's sort of akin to what's happening in the United States with terms like "Make America Great Again." It's very abstract. It doesn't really refer to anything, but it tries to evoke an idea, an emotion that people can cling on to. And I'll talk about this a bit more moving forward. But Neo-Ottomanism is essentially the term that's used to describe this, and it's a revitalization of Ottoman ideals and culture, tradition, and geographic power. And it's a very powerful movement in that again, it's not entirely specific. It's more of a feeling. It's sort of recreating asabiya of bringing the group together and having something that they can collectively grapple with and grab hold of. So through selective memory, legal amendments, and revisionism, Turkey's history has been instrumentalized to maintain a particular status quo and preserve the AKP's seat of power. And this seems very evident by what's been happening in the last 5 years, and even within the last 2 decades, of which both Erdogan and the AKP have really garnered a lot of attention and a lot of power. So the effects of neo-Ottomanism are very important to look at. They situate Turkey within an imaginary historical period, as I had mentioned, and this changes the foreign policy prescriptions and global outlook. Obviously, Turkey is a key player within the Middle East. It's a very important part of how both the United States and Europe interact with the Middle East at large. It's been looked at as a beacon of democracy for quite a long time. In 2000, I believe in 2011, it was hailed as the keystone of democracy in the Middle East, which was amazing to see, and it prompted former President Barack Obama to visit Turkey and to have a very special relationship with Erdogan, thinking that Erdogan would be this beacon of hope for the region, if you agree with that idea of democracy and pushing that throughout the region. But regardless, they really performed the idea of democracy quite well. But looking at the smaller details about what's been going on legally in the country, it's clear that that democracy really isn't the main point, and that it's more about power. And the legal system that surrounds Erdogan's presidency is very much situated to keep him in power, and it's very much in line with the project, again, from the early 20th century. So Erdogan has been cultivating a vision of piety centered around the nation's storied past, and he uses media and cultural performance to do this. The government promotes programs that highlight Ottoman history and also refer to this mythical period. One such production, Resurrection, Ertuğrul, which is a relatively good show, I must say. But it's interesting because looking at the protagonists, they face fierce and barbarous crusaders, Mongols, Byzantines, and Christians, and they go through somewhat an ahistorical timeline of fighting these different people, and also going up against issues with morality and issues with religion, and sort of, the main character is really someone that brings the ideals of what it means to be a good subject, what it means to be a good citizen to the fore. And additionally, the film Conquest 1453, which was one of the biggest selling productions in Turkey, had the same sort of issue where you have Fethi Sultan Mehmet, who was fighting the Byzantines, and the Byzantines are these portrayed as morally destitute and horrible people. And of course, Sultan Mehmet is this righteous character that pervades over all of these issues and comes out on top. And it's a really important story for Turkey, because people see that and they think, oh, well, this is wonderful, we're triumphing. It gives people a sense of hope. So obviously there are huge issues with this historically, that it takes selective memory, and it's putting in certain things within the production that are not historically accurate. There's grand images of Ottoman heroes conquering foreign evils, but regardless, this is an extremely powerful motif, and it brings people together and makes them think about where they are in their historical roots in a different way. One of the important things about this is that it's very vague. And this is a very good thing if you're trying to convince people to join your movement, because vaguity is far more dangerous than specificity, because it allows the imagination of a citizen, of an individual, to run wild. It gives them something to cling to that isn't necessarily there. And it really allows it to meld with the individual incredibly well. So these have been very important and impactful ways of changing the dynamic in society. So, as I mentioned, Kemalism, which was the aggressive secularist and pseudo-European policies of Mustafa Kemal, alienated a large percentage of the public by driving a wedge of law between religion and the state. And all this was to say that, Islam became something that was no longer valued in society. It was secularism that was valued. And so the Islamic majority was turned into a minority overnight. And again, this neo-Ottomanism that Erdogan is using is very much backward looking. It's searching for meaning in the past. And this is diametrically opposed to Kemalism and the policies that were enacted by him, that this was a forward-looking movement. It was looking to the future, and it was looking to incorporate the ideals that were evolving in the contemporary world. And you didn't need to look to history to find self-definition, that it was there in the future to be made, to be written yourself. But there's a new value that's being brought to the table now, and it's looking to the past, to find something in the past to give meaning to the present. So now to get to the main point, it's my contention that the legal history has really supported Erdogan, and that, again, Erdogan is not an anomaly, but rather a conclusion of legal amendments and the legal trajectory started in 1839. So again, 1839 is a very important date because the Tanzimat reforms happened, but it was at this period that the state became an entity that could be legally harmed. And you didn't see this before. Before, government and law was governed by Sharia, and the main point of law was to give people the moral and ethical grounds to live a good Islamic life. It was very much focused on the individual, how they lived their life ethically and morally, and that was an important thing. Once we get to 1839, this changes, and the state becomes something that needs to be protected. And so by 1935, it was evident that the government had sort of solidified these ideas, and it had turned itself into an entity very much like a corporation, right? You have this abstract entity that now takes on a physical manifestation, right? Physical in the sense that it's been included into a legal document. And this was a very important thing. And so the transition to republicanism concentrated the protection of the state. And it was designed to be rigid and grounded in conservatism. It was no longer, the individual was no longer a primary legal concern. And this was proven through the adoption of Napoleonic fascist criminal codes. And which is really interesting to look at the history of law, is that Turkey is very much a Frankenstein compilation of laws. There's Swiss civil law, there is Napoleonic law, and there is Italian law. And they use these different laws to create a very strong, solid, conservative state that was its entire purpose was to protect the state. That's the main goal. It's no longer about the individual, it's about protecting the state. And again, you can understand why. It's a young state, just like if you had a young child, you don't necessarily want people holding your baby. You want to protect it and make sure that it's safe in every aspect possible. And so I see this reflected in the legal history of this period, that they wanted to protect the state from backlash from the secularist movement that was in place and moving. So it's interesting to see that Mustafa Kemal admired Mussolini, at least it's being argued, and that Italy's fascist codes, the 1839 Royal Italian Code that was used during Mussolini's reign, was taken verbatim, certain sections, and used in Turkey's amendments, the new amendments on criminal codes. And so it's interesting to see this because the force of the fascist-derived law really became very potent in 1938, where you have language like crimes against the international personality of the state, and different laws that are protecting the state in a very, very strong way. And it's very clear that the structure of Turkish law still is based on fascism, and there are laws there that have been taken directly from this. And it is interesting to note that there are very interesting relationships, particularly between libel and protecting the presidency, one of which is that the president can sue for libel, which is a unique position that a president has. And a number of years ago, Erdogan had brought a number of cases to the general public for many silly things, arguably, and it earned somewhere close to £275,000 against people that were critiquing the president, or rather criticizing the president. And it's important to note that it's hard to say that you have a democracy when the president is able to sue for libel. And this idea, though, is supported by the legal history. It's supported by the legal amendments from 1839, from 1935, and trying to sue someone for drawing you like a cat is an interesting relationship that is really supported by these particular laws. So to summarize somewhat, as I have a few more minutes left. Turkey's struggle with democracy, and arguably, and also with the rest of the international community, is rooted in the legal structure. That's my contention. And it's very clear to see this when you consider the crackdown on journalists, academics, dissenting opinions. These are all perfect manifestations of the Turkish legal project. The laws that are set in place don't necessarily reflect the ideals that the government wants to pursue. And it is interesting to see that power has really solidified around Erdogan. And notably, the coup that happened in 2016 really cemented the power of Erdogan in a way that we hadn't seen before. And notably, he changed the parliamentary system to a presidential system, which was incredibly impactful, considering that he is now able to pick the judiciary, the body of law. And when you control the authors of law, then you control the narrative. And this is extremely important because considering where we started in 1839 to 2016, 2017, when the parliament or rather when the judiciary was being chosen by Erdogan, it's very clear that this is a natural progression. And so it's not anomalous. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not because of someone that's very charismatic that happened to win the hearts of the population, although of course that's true. But it is a continuation of these legal reforms that have led to a point where now Erdogan has close to authoritarian power. If you're able to choose the legal authors, then you're able to control a narrative in the country that is unparalleled. And so it's important to note this, that again, there's a timeline here that it's attached to. And I think much of the commentary that came out around the 2016s and 17s was missing this point, that it just didn't connect the dots to the history that came before it to notice that, well, this is more of a trend than it is an anomaly. So finalizing my ideas, it's very clear that in order to move forward, it will be interesting to see how this legal history is implemented in the future. And there's an interesting thing that happened recently where Erdogan lost the city of Istanbul, the mayoral election, to Ekrem İmamoğlu. And this was a very important movement because centers which Erdogan thought he had, that were his strong bases like Ankara and Istanbul, he lost. And there was a great dissatisfaction with Erdogan's policies, and this is shown through the voting that went through. But of course, it was contested. They asked for another vote to be taken to make sure that it was legitimate. And again, when you control the legal narrative, you can do this. You can argue and say, well, there was an issue, and you can always make an excuse, essentially, if you have the power to do so. And so this did happen, and it will be very interesting to see if İmamoğlu wins in 2023, if he does decide to run, which I think he will. There is still a significant legal history that is underpinning and supporting the Turkish presidency and the Turkish government. So I'm not sure that great reforms would be able to happen immediately. The AKP has generally blamed the laws for a number of the things that they do. They've said that they inherited outdated laws, outdated systems, and that you can't blame the government for cracking down on journalists and for the harshness toward individuals in the state, towards censorship. They're just saying, oh, well, it's not entirely our fault. It's in the legal codes. This is supported. So what do you want us to do? We have to amend the law, but that's a very lengthy process. We don't have the resources yet necessarily. And it's a really good excuse to get away with doing things that are quite egregious. So I guess my final note on this would be to say that Turkey is in a very interesting position, and it will be in an interesting position moving forward. Again, depending on how the presidential elections of 2023 go, it will be interesting to see how this legal structure supports the next president, whether that will be, in fact, Erdogan again, or whether it will be İmamoğlu or someone else that comes into contention is unclear. But what is clear is that this legal precedent, this very strong legal precedent about protecting the state, will be in fact still in place unless amendments are taken. And so all of this ties back into the way Turkey sees itself, its self-definition. It's very much about protecting its identity, protecting its self-definition, and this doesn't necessarily mold or mesh with democratic ideals. And I think that's part of the tension that exists between the state and democracy and secularism. There are a lot of other issues that I just simply don't have time to go over. I mean, particularly between religion and the state, these types of things. But the main point is that law is really an important thing that should not be overlooked when considering the trajectory of the Turkish state. So thank you again for listening, and I'd love to hear comments or criticisms, but thank you again.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Benjamin. If you can stop sharing your screen now, that'd be great. Okay, that was fantastic. And it was really good to end focusing right back in on Turkey domestically there. I think, you know, what we've had on this panel, obviously there's a focus on Turkey, but I think the different levels that we've seen here, you know, having this kind of nice domestic focus, looking at legal history, then looking at kind of Turkish responses to wider links with China, you know, domestically throughout its history, and then the wider systemic impacts and constraints and opportunities that are provided by the international for Turkey have actually melded really well together. And it's lovely to see that kind of, I think, where we have the intersection of these different levels of analysis is, you know, where we can gain some really good insight into Turkey's place in the region and in global politics, but also developments within the country itself. And I think we get a really interested insight there into, I mean, Benjamin finished off there mentioning these, you know, different importance of protecting the identity, and we see different identity strains there, you know, in the papers that we've had today, very much so, be it from the kind of, you know, pan-Turkic or even the pan-Islamist angle that some of elements of Beste's presentation looked at, from the kind of internal debates going on in terms of relationship between secularism and Islam within Turkey as well, as the last presentation showed, or then, like I say, those wider systemic issues and how questions about multipolarity feed into that, and again Turkey's position within that. So I think we've had a very rich discussion, and really grateful for these papers. So we have a few questions that have come through for each of you, which is good. So what I'll do, I'll read them out, and then I'll give you a chance to have your thoughts, and I'll have some questions as well. And for our attendees who are watching, please do use the question answer section to pop the questions in, and I shall read them out to our presenters. Okay, so our first question, this is for Beste. This is from Francesco Belcastro, and guys, you'll also be able to see the questions on here, but I'll just read it out for our attendees as well. So Francesco says, thanks for a great presentation. I am fascinated by this generational cleavage you described. Would you then say that a new generation, if it brought a different mindset and ideological references, could they bring yet another change of policy or narrative, and is that likely to happen in your view?
Well, thank you very much, Francesco, for the question. And what do you have in mind? A new generation bringing in a new set of ideological differences, policies. Well, I think the government, with its purging the Gulenist diplomats from the foreign ministry after the coup attempt in 2016, thought that maybe a new generation would help with sort of driving the narrative away from the old ways. But it's really tough, because a lot of this goes back to how you are really brought up within the Turkish family as well. Because remember, Turkish people are really involved in politics, and many of these upcoming diplomats, even if they're young, they are trained primarily in their families, and then in the university by the professors who are in favor of those old policies that I mentioned, starting from the end of Second World War. And just imagine this was a 70-year-old project, and just imagine how successful it was. It wasn't. It ended up being in jail. And the reason for that is because there are constitutional foundations to a country, to a nation, to a republic, right? And many of that ideology, that narrative, that policy brought with it is the shaming of Turkish identity, and all sorts of apologies from, say, from the Armenian apology to Kurdish apology, demeaning the independence war, demeaning the Turkish Republic, and so all these things, they were not acceptable from the Turkish public opinion stance, the majority. And if it could be brought, a new policy narrative with a different group, maybe, not the same group. I think the AK Party government is struggling with that because of the reasons that I mentioned in the beginning. Maybe bringing in different individuals from different backgrounds with different backgrounds could help, but it really depends. Its success really depends on how much it overlaps with the constitutional foundations of the country as well. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Wonderful, many thanks. Okay, next question. We have a question here. This is for Benjamin. This is from Omar Monasser. Omar asks, first, what do you mean by revisionism? Is that at the domestic or regional level? And do you tend to argue that the AKP's new self-identification, self-images such as neo-Ottomanism, impact on, I think, Turkish foreign policy, that is, TFP's orientation, as some scholars argue recently, and that is shifting from a regional status quo power to revisionist power? So a bit of a kind of foreign policy take on that. I know obviously yours was focused domestically, so you did say you had lots more to add though, so perhaps perhaps that's part of it.
Yeah, sure. I'm more than happy to answer this. Thank you for the question, Omar. So revisionism, all I mean by that is that the previous historical interpretations of neo-Ottomanism have been changed. And if you look at Turgut Özal's policies, who was the former president of Turkey, it was a radically different take on neo-Ottomanism, where it was about forward-looking and looking to the future, looking to write your own history, but also having a sense of pride in the Ottoman past, just a pride in the history of the Turkish people. And so this was a very different interpretation. It was very neoliberal. It was, civic-based, and yet now what we have with Erdogan is it's revising those types of ideas. And so now, again, as I mentioned, it's backward looking. It's not looking to the future. It's looking to find the answer to the future in the past, find the self-definition in the past and make that the focal point. So that's what I'm referring to when I speak about revisionism. And then for the question about Turkey shifting from a regional status quo power to revisionist power, you're very much correct, there have been quite a few arguments about this. And it's difficult to argue that because Turkey has lost most of its allies in the Middle East. I think now it can only count Qatar as its main ally in the region. And a lot of this has to do with these new interpretations of neo-Ottomanism, whether they're explicitly stated or not. So I think that the issue of, sorry, the question keeps moving around here in my the Q&A section, but I think much of this has to do with the relationship between the state and its own definition. So in terms of foreign policy, it does affect that in a way that we haven't seen before necessarily. I mean, you know, as I mentioned, there's ideas of having this Ottoman Empire in the minds of certain politicians, and that doesn't necessarily translate into taking over the territory, but I think a renewed relationship with the Balkans, with Russia, with these territories that used to have a relationship with the Ottoman Empire is very much increasing. And so that's foreign investments, making cultural ties, and also trying to connect with the Muslims of those regions that are very much seen as part of the Ummah and part of the family of Turkey that have been lost over years due to conflicts and otherwise. So hopefully that answered your question, but you could let me know if I didn't quite get it.
Wonderful, thanks, Benjamin. That was great. I'm sure if Omar wants to come back, he's more than welcome to as well. Another question now. This one for Michael, and this is again from Francesco. He said it's a really fascinating panel. He has lots of questions. This one's for Michael. Thanks for a great presentation. Do you think that the tensions between Turkey and Russia on Libya specifically, as well as the dynamics of the conflict, might have implications for EU policy towards the region, given how powers such as France, Italy, etc., are divided and see either Russia or Turkey as the main threat? So is there a risk of a rift opening, and could that undermine the broader effectiveness of an already fragmented European foreign policy in the Mediterranean? And the question's on there as well, Michael, as well, if you hopefully you can see it as well, if you want to refer to it.
Thank you, Francesco, for the question. I think you can already see a rift opening up, particularly between France and Italy. The French have been much more active in their support for, if you're talking about Libya, the French have been much more active in their support for Haftar than the Italians have been. And all of that is like the larger geopolitical rivalry between Russia and Turkey I've been discussing. You know, the fact that there's a disparity between the two policies between France and Italy is largely an effect of American retrenchment. The fact that, and I'd say rather than a risk of there being a rift, I think there already is a rift based on, you know, the very localized strategic interests of the French government or the Italian government. You know, in 2011, all of that could kind of be subsumed under the umbrella of, you know, NATO cooperation in pursuit of 1973. And that was done more or less against the rather muted complaints of the Russians, who still voted, or I believe they abstained from the vote on 1973. But you could see somewhat of like a united front against Russian support for the Gaddafi regime. And that kind of unity in EU policy that was kind of engendered by NATO cohesiveness has totally evaporated. And this is the general logic behind, you know, the multipolar phenomena that affect Libya, is that there is no, you know, single driving agenda like there was in 2011, and now everything's essentially subject to the whims of this government, that government. And I could have easily talked about, you know, the role of the EU in Libya alongside, you know, they're a major player alongside the Egyptians. I just focused specifically on Russia and Turkey, but talking about EU policy in Russia, that's right. EU policy towards Russia and Turkey as a whole, that's a subject for a whole nother talk, and probably a much more longer and interesting talk than the one that I gave. But I'd say in general, if you're wondering whether or not a rift will open up, I think the rift is already there, and it's already being exacerbated by the day. And, you know, the fact that Italy and France and the EU are not really the biggest players in Libya, yet at the same time they suffer, especially Italy suffers the largest number of domestic political consequences from the war in Libya. If you're talking about migration flows, that's what makes these cleavages even greater, is that, you know, there's little amount of control and large amounts of political damage that these governments have to endure, and that there's simply no control from any single source. And it's that's such is the logic of multipolarity, is that, you know, you have to take into account the actions of a large number of actors, and cohesiveness, any kind of cohesiveness in policy, is effectively absent. so yeah, Federico Mogherini doesn't have effective control over EU policy in Libya. It's definitely dictated on a unilateral level by individual governments, and that's to a large extent subject to the same, or it's because of the same forces that have resulted in this kind of Turkish-Russian rivalry. So it's similar. It's very similar in its origin, but in another way, it's very different in its effect. I hope that covers the question that you asked.
I think that's very good, and you do yourself a disservice there, Michael. It's a fascinating paper. I'd much rather hear that one on EU Russia, but that's a different conference entirely. Okay, thanks. Great answer. We have another question here for Beste. This is from Cihan Gunduz. Thanks you for your presentation. As you've mentioned, the Uyghur issue in Turkish public opinion, and which individuals and groups support and lobbies Chinese and Maoist ideology in Turkey? So are there any kind of, I think that's asking, is there more kind of pro-Chinese take on that, if I've understood it correctly, within Turkey that you're aware of?
Right. So remember I mentioned university movements in the 1970s and in the 1980s. I think the question of the Maoist ideology being effective in Turkey can be traced back to that time when the leftist movements in the universities also, while they were having these clashes with the right-wing movements, they were also having an inner conflict clash among themselves. Some being pro-Soviet and others being pro-Mao, and adopting the Maoist narrative that Soviet Union has become revisionist in its policies and against the Balkan states. So I think there's a referral to that. And those individuals, those students at the time, there are active political figures currently in Turkish politics that were among those students in the 1970s and 80s. They do have a political party in Turkey. It's called Vatan Party, and probably I think the Maoist ideology today, I think it wouldn't be relevant, but I guess it depends on what you are referring to as Maoist ideology today, because Maoist ideology being not meddling into other countries' affairs, the sovereignty issue, the national issue, the unity of the nation, these still are advocated by this group. They have seen a surge in their political and public image in the recent years. There has been publications in foreign magazines that they sort of might be driving the Erdogan policy approach towards Russia, towards China. But I think at the end of the day, most of it is coming from the reasons that I studied earlier. So it wasn't a choice made voluntarily. The Turkish public opinion did not accept a Syrian intervention to overthrow Assad. The Turkish public opinion did not accept an apology from the Kurds, didn't accept a federation in the northern Syria. So at the end of the day, the government really adopted the policies to stay in power and to respond to Turkish public opinion. Not the current policy is not driven by a lobby at the time, but it is more driven for Turkish governments willing to first of all, stay in power, to stay in power, and also to respond to growing Turkish public opinion that we are becoming more and more involved in American conflicts in the Middle East. We are economically too dependent for our own good, etc., etc. But yeah, there are certainly individuals from that time, from 1970s, who did advocate Maoist ideology against the Soviet aggression and interventionism, who are still active in Turkish politics.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Beste. It's very interesting the way in your presentation you pulled that kind of genealogy through and that kind of link from that time with people who are still politically active today. It's a fascinating subject. Okay, we have another question. This is from Iyad Al-Rafai. It's for Benjamin, although I think actually this is something that everyone might want to answer, but if we go to Benjamin first, and that's how is this sense of a neo-Ottoman approach being depicted right now in the region? So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, we see streets that named after the Ottoman sultans were being substituted with Saudi more nationalist names, and that's just happened very recently. And you know, if Turkey loses the Saudi public, which you could argue it's already happening, you know, will it be able to embark, I think, on a wide approach without the good relations with the custodians of the two holy mosques? And also, what about the new issue surrounding Hagia Sophia as well? So, Benjamin, if you had thoughts on Iyad's question, and then others, welcome to chip in as well.
Sure. So in terms of neo-Ottomanism in the region, I think much of this can be seen through the pan-Islamic ideology that's moving through the Balkans and other regions, as I said, that were former territories of the Ottoman Empire. And, you know, Erdogan sees himself in some way as trying to regroup Muslims in the region. And I think the challenging thing with Islam is that there isn't one religious leader, unlike Christianity with the Pope, where you have someone to look at for direction. And so considering the fact that there's a vacancy, I think Erdogan has been trying to fill this position in some way or form by supporting mosques, by building many mosques, both in Turkey, but also abroad. You know, he's supporting the building of mosques in other countries, supporting Muslims, and you can definitely see this idea of you know, reaching out and regrouping and bringing people back into, you know, the comfort of that. But I think I very much agree with Beste in her presentation earlier that it's not really, this isn't political Islam. It's more about national interests and more about power, and it's simply under the guise of Islam. At least that's my particular opinion. I don't see Erdogan is a serious Muslim practitioner. I don't think that he fills the role of someone that could even possibly fill the position of being a leader for Muslims in the region. So that's the first point. And then connecting to the idea of the streets being pulled in Saudi Arabia, that's very recent. I think it was this month. And a lot of this has to do with the relationship between Saudi Arabia, or rather Turkey and Qatar. So obviously Qatar and Saudi Arabia are having issues at the moment, and because Turkey is so closely aligned with Qatar, Saudi Arabia and its population are certainly going to, you know, be opposed to Turkey and be opposed to the policies that they're putting in place. So it makes sense to me that that they're changing the street names. They're trying to distance themselves from Turkey, and sending a message that, you know, if you are aligning with Qatar and with someone that is against us, then clearly you're not with us. So those are my views.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Benjamin. If Michael or Beste wants to come in, you're more than welcome to. Don't feel obliged. We have other questions pending, but if you want to comment on that, you're welcome to. I shall take your silence as a no.
No, I was reading the other question. Someone wrote a question about Eurasianists, and maybe I was thinking I failed to mention that also these individuals that I mentioned, pro China, individuals in Turkish politics are referred to as Eurasianists as well. So that's why I was concentrated on the question, the next question.
No problem. Well, that's a question we can ask. I think all of you as well. I'm just going to abuse my position as chair here, and I've got a question I wanted to ask Michael, and it's a bit more of an observation as well as a kind of question as well. And I think I really like the way that you talked about this kind of how Middle East is no longer being subject to unipolar forces, and what we're seeing now is perhaps an articulation of how greater multipolarity is affecting the region. So the first sort of part of that is to what extent does this signify the end of a kind of Pax Americana, so an end of a unipolar moment? Is that where you think we're going? And then the second question, if I may, which is slightly related to that, and it's to do with sort of new alliance building, and that's the place of Iran. I'm someone who concentrates mainly on Iranian foreign policy in my own research, and you see this kind of pragmatic rapprochement between Iran and Turkey at various points. So what's the place of Iran in the kind of broader Russian-Turkish relationship? Is it a possible axis in the making? Are we, would we see something like, we see move towards Iran going into the Eurasian Economic Union? Do you see something like that happening on a kind of Turkish-Russian-Iranian front as well? So if you had any thoughts on that, that'd be great. And if panelists could turn their mics and cameras off, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take the question on Iran first. I think Iran would definitely be the third country that I would have considered if I could expand beyond Russia and Turkey. It's absolutely one of the larger axes in the making. The fact that they're present at the Astana talks as one of the three major players alongside Russia and Turkey means that they're a major player. The only reason I didn't put them up top, one is because they're not as active, or they're not active at all in Libya, frankly. So that I'm trying to draw this kind of broader geopolitical rivalry between Turkey and Russia. Adding Iran to the mix switches it up a little bit, just because it's not as deeply embedded in the larger geopolitical struggles over the Eastern Mediterranean. It's really limited to the classic Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen dynamic, and that geopolitical conflict is fundamentally different than the one that Turkey and Russia is pursuing, which is much more based on immediate geopolitical aims, not really not the kind of proxy building, long-term proxy building that Iran is engaged in. It's at a different level, and to a certain extent, Russian and Turkish interests dovetail with Iranian interests. Some places here, some places there. So for the most part, I feel like Iran it's part of this constellation of fellow travelers on one side or another of a given conflict. But because of its diplomatic isolation, it's not the kind of major player that Russia is. But definitely that's something that the absence of American influence will reduce over time. Iran is everybody except the United States these days seems like they're trying to integrate Iran more and more. The Europeans try to set up instincts for circumvention of U.S. sanctions. Both Russia and Turkey are not interested in enforcing American policy. So I think that Iran will probably get more and more integrated into Mediterranean geopolitical rivalries, even if the United States would prefer that it stays out, just because the influence of the United States is lessening more and more. And I'm embarrassed to say that I cannot recall your first question.
Well, I think you kind of answered it there. Really, it was just is this the kind of the end of a sort of sense of Pax Americana, and really just following on from your paper. Really.
Yeah. So if we say that Pax Americana was more or less what began in 1993 after the Gulf War, that paradigm has completely gone. The United States is not the guarantor of peace in any case. Even so, I'd say probably the death blow for Pax Americana was the Turkish takeover of Afrin and the fact that the United States did not intervene, just because there was a certain analogous quality between that and, I don't want to say that there's a moral equivalency. They're fundamentally different moral problems, but with the Iraqi takeover of Kuwait, in terms of that, it was, a not a violation of sovereignty per se, but it was, the extension of power beyond borders in an extraterritorial fashion. And the United States, that was historically the red line for the United States, was any violation of sovereign borders. And the fact that went, totally unchallenged practically by the United States, even if not rhetorically, the fact that it went unchallenged practically by the United States was the death blow for Pax Americana. And the fact that this kind of multipolar dynamics are beginning to make themselves more apparent is simply the logical conclusion of what the end of Pax Americana means. It means that regional and extra-regional countries will, have free reign to intervene when they please, where they please, and to the extent that they please, without the threat of any kind of intervention or reversal by the United States, which sort of played the apex of the regional hierarchy for a long period of time. That position is gone, and Pax Americana, the decline of Pax Americana, is essentially the beginning point of this entire cascading series of power transitions. I hope that answered the question.
Fantastic. Yes, that's really interesting. And I think it's interesting to pinpoint that moment of the Turkish incursion as well as a possible point. We may look back on that in the future as a kind of watershed moment, certainly. Great. Okay. I've got, again, I'm going to just keep on asking. Yes, please, Beste, did you have something to add to that?
Can I come in a bit on
Of course,
that?
please do. Please do, yeah.
Very short. I think I agree with Michael. I forgot my video. Yes, okay. I agree with Michael on a lot of the issues he raised, but I think it really depends on how the United States and Israel is gonna play the next phase of Syrian war, right? Because at this moment, Turkey and Iran, they're facing similar existential threats. They're facing similar economic and financial strangulation. They're facing similar threats to their territorial integrity in terms of Kurdish separatism. And we tend to forget when we're talking about Turkey and Iran that they do have the longest standing border in the region, despite all the havoc and all the destruction the last century has brought. So I think it really depends how the American and Israeli politics will play out and what Turkey will choose to do at that point. There's no way of predicting that. It's moving a lot because of the reasons I mentioned. There's a lot of movement in the ministries. Even if Erdogan has consolidated power, sometimes he's not able to control what happens on the ground. So I really think that we will be seeing more Israeli involvement in Syria in the future and Syrian affairs. And I think the more the separatist rhetoric is pushed, the more Turkey and Iran will get closer. And there is certainly interest from Turkish side in terms of collaborating with Iran, especially within the framework of Belt and Road Initiative as well. So the interest is there, the conditions are there, but it also depends on the future dynamics of the conflict in Syria, the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean.
Brilliant, thank you. No, it's a very important point to mention that as well. I was asked a similar question a couple of hours ago with relation to Iran's, directions of future Iranian foreign policy, and Israel still looms large within that. So even though we can talk about, a move towards a multipolar Middle East and decline of US power to a certain extent, is where will remain there and will remain an issue for many regional states. Absolutely. I think I'd quite like to ask a question to all panelists, if you could ruminate on this, and it builds actually on a question we have, which Beste briefly alluded to from Omar again, and it's well, I'll ask Omar's first, and then I'll tag a question on to the end of that. So Omar asks to all panelists: we can see recent Turkish foreign policy dynamics. We can see the Erdogan doctrine, and then self-centric Eurasianist identity, etc. So he's asking, I think, does the Russian intervention in Libya affect that kind of Eurasianist identity element of Turkish foreign policy? Does that hamper the kind of Turkish-Russian rapprochement within the kind of Eurasian sphere? So I think it's asking, does the Libyan case cause problems for that? And then if I can tag something onto that, it's really, where does Turkish alliance building go from this point? Because obviously we have Turkey has problems with the US foreign policy. It has real issues with China, and obviously they're still on opposing sides in Syria, despite the diplomatic moves with Russia on that, and obviously relations with the EU have been thorny. So is it, are we talking with much more within the Middle Eastern context, Middle East, North Africa context, that future alliance building will happen from a Turkish perspective? Or what about its wider Eurasian diplomacy? Are we kind of moving towards still trying to secure greater leverage in Central Asia, for example, which is something that's only ever kind of plateaued since the independence of those countries. So where does the sort of, where are we going in the future really, and then that's tagged on to Omar's question. So perhaps if we can come to Benjamin first, if you don't mind taking that, even if you want to look at it from a kind of more domestic angle, looking outwards. That's okay.
Sure. I'm not sure how much I can say on the Russia, Turkey, Libya relationship. I don't have as much information on that because mostly I focus on the legal aspect. But certainly, if it is intercepting with Turkish ideals, with Turkish foreign policy ideals about what is part of their vision board of what they'd like to do, then I would see that being an issue and challenging these ideas of Eurasianist identity and that sort of thing. So that's at least all I can say for that. I'm sure the other panelists will have more. But in terms of moving forward, it will be interesting, as I said, to see what happens in the next few years, because recent polls have showed, there's a website called Conda, and they do polling. They've looked at long-term polling over the last decade, I think, and have tracked things like religion, how religious people see themselves, their sort of daily practices, marriage, all this. And it's very clear that the nation is becoming more secular, but that doesn't necessarily translate into less religious. And I think that's an important distinction. So the outward expression of religion is slightly decreasing, and the very strong policies, or maybe the regimented practices of praying 5 times a day, this kind of thing, are also declining, but it doesn't mean people are less religious. And so moving forward, it's interesting to see that these newer policies and younger generation that have only had Erdogan as their president, mind you, right? The people my age in their 20s have only experienced Erdogan. And so I think it's very interesting to see a new generation come up with different ideas. They've been exposed to a different way of viewing the world. Some younger generations are no longer wearing hijab. They're making different decisions with their dating life, this sort of thing, their family life. So all of this is sort of pushing Turkey in a different direction, I think, and that's clear from the election that happened in Istanbul. It's very difficult to predict what happens in the future, obviously, but I think between the youth that are coming up and the different ideas about what Turkey could be, and then the upcoming election will be a really interesting period to watch in Turkey for those reasons.
Great, thank you, Benjamin. Michael, did you?
Yeah, sure. So on the subject of, say, this kind of Eurasianist identity, I'm guessing you're talking about cooperation and a kind of rapprochement between Turkey and Russia. What's very interesting about the relationship between the two countries is how it kind of operates on two different levels. You've got the regional cooperation, or not, I'm sorry, the regional competition that you see playing out, in Syria and in Libya, which would seem to be antagonistic. Yet at the same time, when you're talking about the wider systemic implications of their relationship, they seem to attempt to cooperate um, in not necessarily in opposition to, but at least in an attempt to both distance themselves from um, NATO and especially in the case of Russia, to attempt to weaken NATO, but in the case of Turkey, to attempt to distance itself from NATO and improve its own military self-sufficiency and ability to act unilaterally. So you could talk about the kind of establishment of this identity that is in opposition to American hegemony and seeks to resolve regional disputes with new forums outside of the context of American diplomacy that is relatively agreed on by both Turkey and Russia, and they both cooperate to that end. And in that sense, you could talk about kind of a joint identification, but it's spurred on purely by other political interests that are in opposition to the United States. I'm not sure that this kind of mutual identification that they've had, where Turkey buys S-400s, or there's other military ties, these types of things, would be able to perpetuate themselves in the absence of kind of an antagonistic quality between the relations between Moscow and Washington and Ankara and Washington. I think the kind of Eurasian identity is really more of a reactionary identity against a greater American hegemony, and is kind of an effort to assert some kind of independence, particularly on the part of Turkey from traditional foreign policy, which was essentially in lockstep with NATO. And that's why, even though the relationship is definitely competitive, in Syria and Libya, they back separate sides, that kind of competitiveness doesn't seem to manifest itself whenever you see a bilateral summit, or you see, Putin and Erdogan bilaterally negotiating over something. That kind of antagonistic quality just doesn't seem to appear. So in one sense, yes, there is an emerging new block of power that you could call, some kind of Eurasian identity. At the same time, I don't think it would outlast any kind of shared interest. It's not based on, mutual identification as, authoritarian countries or democratic countries. This is purely opportunistic in nature, and that's why I think that calling it an identity might be a bit too much for the moment. It's more of an alliance of convenience.
Great, thanks, Michael. That's very helpful. Beste, did you have anything to add on that? I know you briefly touched on it before, but
sure. I think there's always a misinterpretation of the word Eurasia when it is discussed in certain contexts. And I think in this context, in Turkey's context of Eurasia, I think it's a concept that is more than Russia. And so I would be very surprised if Russia took the chance to sort of step on Turkey in Libya, go ahead and keep on doing what it feels like is the right thing to do. Because what is Turkey? Turkey is the Balkans, right? Turkey is Africa. Turkey is Central Asia. Turkey is very active in Latin America. So in terms of soft power, but now also hard power, Russia would not take the chance of doing that. But also, I think in Turkey's Eurasianist approach to politics, I think it's also more than Russia. I don't think Turkey omits in any way Europe from the definition of Eurasia. I think Turkey still has sees that its interests lie with European economies as well as China and the Central Asia. So I think the dynamics there are a bit different when we are talking about Eurasia. So yes, in the future, what holds for future, I think this is a time that Turkish diplomacy has really taken off, and it's so active. It has never been like this before, and I think it has passed the threshold that it is just a reaction to American policies of its strangulation and oppression. It is more of a like Turkish diplomats and Turkey is really enjoying this role, and they're experimenting with it, right? They're going ahead and advocating Azerbaijan in one, but they are also not not comfortable with reaching out to Armenia in their own capacity, without the restraints of the past, and without the past shameful rhetoric that the former foreign ministry diplomats were pushing. So I think in the future, Turkey will play a greater role, a much greater role, in becoming. What was it that was mentioned in a prior panel? It was leading power. I don't like the word rising power as well, or regional power. I think it will be one of the leading powers in diplomacy and economy. It promises a lot for the region. Yeah, that's my point of view.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I think that does hit on some really very important wider points about where Turkey positions itself, where it sees itself. When you mention, Turkey is of Europe, of the Balkans, of the Middle East, of North, the kind of conception of itself as a central power, I think, which informed, a lot of the sort of foreign policy thinking of the AKP, people like Davutoğlu and stuff. I think that's really kind of key to where Turkey sees itself, which is why it's able to play kind of multiple different roles. And there's parallels with other states like Iran who have this kind of like to use this bridge metaphor in terms of connecting different regions and stuff. And you alluded to the the wider issues of things like the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean that they're going to be just on a very kind of material level, but these infrastructural things kind of help reinforce some of those narratives as well and serve them quite well. But as ever, Turkey has a big balancing act to play, not only in terms of its multifaceted, multi-directional foreign policies, but the strains within Turkish politics and the kind of different currents and different political forces that operate within that. Let's see. I think we may have. Okay, look. We've got maybe one last question through here, and then we can wrap up. And this is from Iyad again. Okay, what is the main pillar in Turkish diplomacy, and how shifting from NATO affect its alliances? Is it overstretching Syria and Libya with its own domestic economic issues and political turmoil? So. Yeah, I mean, it sort of builds on that last question, really. But yeah, how would shifting from NATO affect its broader alliances, and is it overstretched in Syria? Do we think? Would anyone like to take that? It's an open question, really. No, okay. Beste first, and then Michael.
All right. Is Turkey really shifting from NATO? It's a very interesting question. Turkey is taking a lot of leading roles. Turkish diplomats are taking a lot of leading roles in NATO, and Turkey is there supporting Ukraine, brokering deals, all sorts of deals between Ukraine and Russia. As I mentioned, the Balkan diplomacy is ever vibrant. So I don't know if Turkey is really divergent in the sense that it doesn't value or doesn't want to be in NATO any longer. I think it's other powers that are more sort of questioning NATO. But the main pillar of Turkish policy, Turkish diplomacy, at this point would be sovereignty and territorial integrity. Because remember, Turkish diplomats in the beginning of the Syrian conflict, Syrian war, wanted to go in and intervene, but they couldn't because the public opinion was not there. And the only time they were able to sort of rally the public behind that military intervention was when the case was made in PKK's in the understanding that PKK was attacking Turkey from Syria, and that a possible formulation of a federation in northern Syria would mean greater complications for Turkey's territorial integrity. So this seems to be its primary pillar in conducting diplomacy at this point. And I think Turkey will be there in NATO, trying to sort of balance or keep the alliance going for its own sake, even if the United States or, say, France are voicing their discontent and discomfort with the NATO. Turkey is not going to jeopardize the alliances it has already within NATO, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to be looking for different alliances outside that, such as Iran, China, etc. But alliance is a big word, and it really depends on what you understand from an alliance. So sovereignty, I would say sovereignty and territorial integrity are the main pillars of Turkish diplomacy conduct at this point. Thank you.
I think we lost Edward, so.
Yeah, go on. I just noted that Eddie's connection dropped, but he'll be with us shortly. Oh, there he is.
Go ahead and answer.
Hey, apologies. My internet just dropped out.
So I'll tackle the point that Iyad raised about whether or not Turkey is overstretched in Syria and Libya. You could answer this one fairly simply. They're winning in at least one of the conflicts. They're winning in Libya, essentially since the infusion of Turkish support for, Sarraj's government. So even if they may be losing on one front, if they're winning on at least one front, if they're winning on another front at least, then I wouldn't consider them overstretched at all. Sure, they've had domestic economic issues, particularly with the inflation of the lira, but they're in an infinitely better position than Iran to exercise regional and extra-regional intervention, or they don't have sanctions, or they don't have the same level of sanctions that Iran does. They have a fairly diversified economy. So, you could talk about the inflation in the lira, and yes, that is definitely a problem for the domestic economy, but they're in a better position than a lot of countries to exercise influence. And the fact that they're able to fundamentally change the balance of power in Libya would suggest to me that they're definitely not overstretched. They're still acting well within their level of competence, and they're exercising, an effective level of influence. So I think, I wouldn't consider them overstretched at this point.
If I may jump in with one quick point.
Please do.
Just about the relationship of NATO and Turkey. Whether Turkey sees itself differently in NATO is one issue, but I think NATO's perspective of Turkey has certainly shifted in the last couple of years, particularly with the jailing of so many journalists, of academics. That has caused a lot of concern as to the relationship between NATO and Turkey. And so I do agree with Beste's points about Turkey's own perceptions of NATO, but I think considering the rest of NATO's perceptions is also very important. That they're very nervous about the developments in Turkey and what's going to come next. But Turkey has proven to be an extremely valuable and trustworthy source for one thing, which is the control of the Black Sea. I think it was the 1936 Montreux Convention, if that's the right year. But basically, they control access to the Black Sea, which is integral for Russia, for a number of the other Balkans, for a number of the other states that use that particular port. And they've been a very reliable source and a rather reliable government for that particular avenue. But again, there are some real concerns about Turkey's reliability in its other aspects. And so I think it's just worth noting, just to add on to that point.
Great, many thanks, Benjamin. Okay, well, unless we've got any other questions, or unless any of the panelists have any further questions they want to raise, you're more than welcome to. Then I think we're pretty close to wrapping this up. No final questions. I'll just give you a moment. No? Okay, I shall take silence as assent. So thank you very much to our three panelists today. We've had some really, really great insight, and it's really nice to see how the papers talk to each other as well. And we've got a great overview of Turkish foreign domestic politics, legal history, great context given, really, really rich stuff there. So I really appreciate all three of you coming along and sharing your time with us today. And I think we've all learned a great deal. So just to say, our final panel of this 3 days will be beginning at just under 40 minutes time at 4:30 Greenwich Mean Time, and that is civil conflict and disorder in the modern Middle East. And we have papers on Iraq, on Syria, US, and the Algerian civil war as well. And that's going to be chaired by our very own Olivia Glombitsa. So do pop along to that if you can. And that will be finished as well by a final concluding remarks session by Simon Maybont as well, who's going to wrap things up. So thank you once again to all of our excellent presenters and for all of you guys for attending as well. Great to have you.